All right, hello everybody, and what is up? Today we're going to be in lesson 3 of the Cold War. This is our Unit 8 lecture series, and this is going to be part 2. We're talking about the Cold War intensifying, growing larger here in the 1950s. So remember that the post-World War II, the post-World War II world is deeply divided, okay? The Cold War, this ideological, non-traditional war between the United States and the Soviet Union that kicks off after World War II is going to deeply divide the world community into those nations that aligned with the Western world and with like the United States and our democratic capitalist notions of how the world should be, and those nations that are going to be somewhat forced to align with the Soviet way of doing things, which is known, remember, as communism, and that's why it's in red. And so this map is a wonderful way to see what I'm talking about right here. That remember, NATO is our Cold War defensive alliance. All for one and one for all. If we get attacked, then we're all coming to each other's aid. That's a defensive alliance. NATO stands for, remember, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so NATO member nations are those that are in the dark, like navy blue. So that's, of course, the United States, Canada. You have over here in Europe, also in the North Atlantic Ocean, right? You have Portugal, you have Great Britain or the United Kingdom, you have Norway, you have France, you have the Netherlands, you have Belgium, you have Italy, you also have, let's see, that's Switzerland, Austria is part of it. And you're going to have Greece and Turkey, because remember, those were the first places in Truman's doctrine on containment policy that we were setting out to save. So those are the member nations of NATO. And then on the opposing communist side, those nations that are forced to ally with the Soviet Union's defensive alliance treaty, that is going to be the Warsaw Pact nations. So in the dark red, you see like Russia itself, the Soviet Union, the USSR. And then you see those Eastern European nations that Russia had taken over right here. They're part of the Soviet Union at this time. And then the other Eastern European nations, such as Bulgaria, you have Slovakia, the Czech Republic, East Germany, because remember, Germany is divided. It's been divided since Yalta in February of 1945. And well, since we decided it was going to be divided. And then Poland. Those are the satellite nations forced to, remember, stay in the orbit of the Soviet Union. They are under the Soviet Union's control. Other nations in the world that are also communist and somewhat allied with the Warsaw Pact are like China right here. And you can see Myanmar, where there is violent uprisings happening right now in 2021 as they dispute their election results. And then you also have this nation right here that is going to be a point of concern later on in American history, and that, of course, is the nation of Afghanistan. The nations in light blue are those that were more allied with the United States and with our NATO member nations. So, of course, you see like Australia, New Zealand there, and some of the others like Mexico, also part of kind of more in line with our NATO ideas. So the world is taking sides in this Cold War between us and the Soviet Union. Now, as far as the satellite nations go, many of them wanted to be free. They were trying to break free. Stalin died in 1953, and many of these countries in Eastern Europe thought that it would be a good time to maybe have some freedom. You know, ever since World War II, they have had nothing but bloodshed and oppression. And so there's going to be several rebellions happening, notably in Hungary and in Poland. In the 1950s, as these nations tried to break away and become free. This is where the new premier, the new leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, is going to show his true colors. We thought he might be more easy to deal with than like the mass murdering sociopath that was Joseph Stalin, man of steel. But Nikita Khrushchev proves to be just as much of a tyrannical dictator when he violently ends these rebellions of the peoples of Eastern Europe. You can see right here, here's a Soviet tank being sent in to stop these protesters like in the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. And meanwhile, the United States, we're just gonna sit by and kind of watch this stuff happen. All of these nations that you see here in the light red are the satellite nations. They're under the control of the Soviet Union. In the dark red is actually the Soviet Union itself, right? And then in purple is Yugoslavia, which is a communist ally of the Soviet Union, okay? Now, all of these nations that you see here, these are behind what is called the Iron Curtain, okay? Remember, this is this metaphoric dividing line between what is free and what is communist in Europe. In America, we call it, well, Winston Churchill called it the Iron Curtain because we can't do anything to help those people. Our containment policy from the Truman Doctrine says that we're gonna fight communism from spreading. It doesn't say anything about us fighting communism where communism already exists, because remember, that's why this is a Cold War. We can't do an all-out fight against the Soviet Union because that would lead to nuclear warfare and, you know, MAD, mutually assured destruction. So we can't help these peoples, unfortunately. And it is heartbreaking if you recall all the struggles that Poland went through in like World War II, when it was literally divided, invaded on both sides. The Polish people had, you know, some of the worst fighting in all of World War II, and they had the worst concentration in death camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka, and we can't help them. This is the Cold War and the stakes are too high. Here you see the Polish people trying to rebel against Soviet rule. They're one of the satellite nations in Eastern Europe. All right, and this brings us to the Middle East. The Middle East is this nation, these nations of the world right here in Southwestern Asia. Okay, so we're talking about the Arabian Peninsula, the desert sands. There's lots of oil in this region. And oil is at the heart of this crisis in 1956 called the Suez Canal crisis. Egypt tried to nationalize its oil reserves and the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is a vital trade link between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. So again, on the world map, this is the Mediterranean Sea right here that separates the continent of Europe from the continent of Africa. The Suez Canal was dug right here. Remember, like we have the Panama Canal over here, a vital trade link between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, okay? Over here in the Middle East, the Suez Canal is a vital trade link between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. So if you're a European, you know, merchant and you need to sell your products, you know, or move your militaries or something from Europe over to anywhere on the East African coast or anywhere in the Middle East or anywhere in Asia, which is, you know, very important, places like India, China, Australia, okay, all these places over here. If you need to move your stuff over there, you have to have access to the Suez Canal or you will not be able to ship your products, because otherwise look what your ships would have to do. They'd have to like leave England right here. They'd have to go all the way around Africa. So the Suez Canal is vitally important for trade, for commerce, and remember, because in the Middle East, this is where most of the oil that Europe's going to get is going to come from. And so there's a war basically fought in 1956 between the United Kingdom, that's Britain, France, and a new country they were allied with called Israel. Israel was created after World War II as a place to resettle the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust from Europe. Israel today is the only Jewish-led nation in the world, and it is surrounded by Muslim Arab peoples who do not like it and will not tolerate it because it was carved out of their homeland. Many of them were pushed aside to make room for these Jews. So Israel exists in a constant state of warfare to defend its existence. And so the United Kingdom, Israel, and France, they were fighting against Egypt over control of this vital trade link, the Suez Canal. Now, for America's part, we don't really want to mess with this. Eisenhower has the Eisenhower Doctrine saying basically we're going to apply containment theory to the Middle East, not just Europe, like Truman Doctrine, you know, containment theory. That was with Greece and Turkey and Western European nations, that we will do whatever it takes to keep them free from communism. But the Eisenhower Doctrine is going to say basically the same thing for the Middle East. We're going to use containment theory to stop the spread of communism anywhere in the Middle East. And with us not really getting involved, the Soviet Union also didn't really get involved. And so Eisenhower probably made a really good call right here, not escalating this Middle Eastern conflict further. So that was the Suez Canal crisis. we will definitely be talking more about oil interest and the Middle East going forward in our American history class. Remember, the Suez Canal is very, very important trade link between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, connects Europe to Asia and all these places in the East, and to oil. All right, and now the last topic for lesson 3 that I really want to cover for you guys, it's one of my favorite things to discuss, is the space race. Remember that we're talking about the Cold War, and we've already talked about another race, the arms race. That was the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union over who has the most nuclear weapons and who has the most powerful nuclear weapons, because whoever had the advantage there would be able to dominate and kill the other. So it was very important that we stayed, at least even in that arms race. The same thing will be true when we're talking about the space race. It's part of the Cold War. It's a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union over who can get a man into space first, who can dominate space, and eventually the finish line becomes who can get a man to the moon first, who can get to the moon first. So this is the space race, the beginning of our exploration of the terrestrial skies. Well, actually not terrestrial, but extraterrestrial skies. There we go. So it all begins with this little beeping silver sphere called Sputnik, okay? Sputnik is the original, very first satellite, the very first object mankind has ever put into space beyond our atmosphere. And this very first satellite was sent up not by the United States, but by the Russians, okay? So in 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, the first satellite, the first object to ever orbit the planet. And this freaks us the heck out. Like, America and the rest of the world was shocked. We were very far behind in any sort of technology to be able to do anything like what Russia had just accomplished, what the Soviet Union had just done. And it's very scary for us that they were able to get an object in space, because space was a great unknown factor at this time. We didn't know a lot about it, but the idea was, especially with the arms race, with the buildup of nuclear weapons, that if you could get objects in space, you could probably get nuclear warheads onto those objects, and you could have them orbit the planet right over on top of where the United States was in space, and have them pointed at us and have a strategic advantage when it came to nuclear arsenals that way. Like, basically be able to shoot us from space and we would have no defense, which is true. And so that was a very scary proposition, and that's going to force the United States to very quickly try to catch up in this space race. So the race is on. We need to get an object up into space. We need to start catching up to the Russians in space technology and rockets and all of these things. And this is where Eisenhower is going to create NASA in 1958. It's called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Its headquarters eventually will be placed in Houston, Texas, because of future Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Cape Canaveral, now Cape Kennedy, in Florida, that is where most of the big NASA rockets are going to be launched from. And so NASA is our space program to try to catch up to the Russians. And one other thing, really big program that Eisenhower, President Eisenhower is going to institute after the Soviet launch of Sputnik is going to be the NDEA. The NDEA is the National Defense and Education Act. It's going to put a whole lot more emphasis and money for education budgets into schools to try to promote more math and science education in middle school and high school classrooms, as well as in college. We feared, and we were somewhat true of this, that we were falling behind when it came to math and science, and that Soviet scientists were much better than American scientists. So to close that gap, we needed to increase our funding and education for math and science. So that's where that comes from. And a lot of the early rocket scientists that we have, keep in mind that they're not going to be American. They're working for NASA. They're working for the government to create, our space program to catch up with the Russians. But many of them were actually from Germany. Some of them were even captured Nazi scientists who had worked on the Nazi rocket program, like Werner von Braun. And so that is a running joke during the space race that both us and the Russians, you know, my German scientists are better than your German scientists. Everybody was using these German scientists on both sides. But basically the space race is going to progress like this. Sputnik gets launched in 1957. All it does, just beep, 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 just goes around the world. But again, it freaks us out. We got to get going. All right, so Eisenhower's going to create NASA. We're going to do the NDA, put an emphasis on math and science in our schools, get our space program going. In the early 50s, we are starting to put together the very first project to get an American in space. And the race is on. Who is going to get a man into space first? Will it be the United States or will it be the Soviet Union? And in 1960, the Soviet Union beats us. They get the first man into space. His name is Yuri Gagarin. And there is pictured there, CCCP, that stands for like a Soviet cosmonaut. That's like their version of an astronaut. And so Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space. Before this, you also had the race to get, an object in space. They beat us there. The race to get an animal into space first, that was done before putting, a manned mission up there. And as far as animals in space goes, you have the Russians beating us again. The first animal ever to go into space was a Russian little Moscow street pooch named Laika. And Laika was sent up in 1957. She did not have the life support systems to support her being alive up there for very long. She ran out of oxygen, and so she did die up there. That is kind of sad. But before she went up there and they sacrificed her to see if that kind of stuff could work, if a living being could exist in space in a rocket ship, she had some puppies, and this is a true story. Basically, the scientist that adopted her off the street and trained her and everything, he gave those puppies to Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, who would later on gift some of those puppies from Laika, the very first animal ever in space, to our United States president in the early 1960s, named John F. Kennedy, because Kennedy had some young children, and so those puppies went to his kids. So you're also going to have America trying to get a living being up into space. We lose, but the first animal that America is ever going to get into space is going to be Ham, who was an American chimpanzee, a little monkey, in 1961. So Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, is a Russian. They beat us with the first objects in space with Sputnik. They beat us with the first animal in space with Laika. They beat us with the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. Meanwhile, America is just playing catch up in this space race. Our first program to get a manned mission up there, a man into orbit, was called Project Mercury. And in the Mercury project, 7 of the best pilots were chosen from all across the United States and from our military branches. They're called the Mercury 7. And we're going to talk a lot more about them later on, because the space race is really going to heat up in the 1960s. We might be behind at the start of it, but like I said, the finish line is going to be who can get to the moon first. Another body of another terrestrial body out there in the heavens, so who can get to the moon first, and we will win that race. We will cross that finish line first in 1969. But to get there, we're going to have to go through several phases. And like I said, the first phase will be Project Mercury, just getting a man up in space for the United States. The first astronaut, the first American ever to go into space, is a guy named Alan Shepard. We'll talk about him later. The next project will be the Gemini project, where we send 2-man missions up to test like spacewalks and other things we need that are vital for the final project to get a man on the moon, and that was the Apollo missions. And we do finally land a man on the moon in 1969. It was Apollo 11. The Eagle has landed. That will be Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Michael Collins had to fly the command ship around the moon as it was orbiting while those guys went down the lunar module, the Eagle. Anyway, I love this space race. My dad he worked for NASA briefly under Jimmy Carter's administration in the late 1970s. I actually, at home, I grew up with this little glass like commemorative thing that my dad got for his work at NASA. He was an administrator. He wasn't like a scientist or anything. He wasn't an astronaut. But for his work that he did while he was there, they gave him this commemorative little plate that has like a piece of tile inside it that was from the space shuttle. Because, you know, the space shuttle is the only reusable spacecraft we've ever created. But the tiling on the bottom of it that goes through, you know, it has to have a heat shield every time it re-enters the Earth's orbit. That has to be replaced after every mission. And so they give those out as like, you know, commemorative awards to employees and stuff. But anyway, that's the space race. It's part of the Cold War. Thank you guys for listening. Don't forget to do your summary. That is the end of our notes in lesson 3, the arms race and the space race in the Cold War. Make sure you talk about that in how the Cold War intensified. And I will talk to you guys later. Thank you. Bye. Ooh, maybe I won't, because our computer here at school is